Tonight, a cross-government meeting's been held about Syria. The rebel group now in charge will stay as a proscribed terror group for now. The Defence Secretary says HTS can still be spoken to as the UK pushes for a stable, peaceful transition. Also tonight, as questions about the murder of 10-year-old Sara Sharif mount, the government signals improved safeguards for homeschooled children are on the way. We'll hear from one minister who says they may have to go even further. Plus, Ian Russell, the father of Molly, who took her own life after viewing harmful content online, joins us as Ofcom prepares to announce new guidelines for tech firms on content. Labour's big housing shake-up. Starmer throws down the gauntlet to local councils. They need to have immediate mandatory targets to build 1.5 million homes by the next general election. But can it be done? And we'll also tell you about today's big Westminster row about sandwiches. Yes, really. After Kemi Badenoch declares them not real food, Downing Street, among others, decides to weigh in. All that and more with Mercy Muroki and Kwajo Tweneboa, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Thursday. I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Now, we want to start with some breaking news tonight because the Defence Secretary has been chairing a cobra meeting this evening about the situation in Syria. Now, following that meeting, John Healey gave this update.
Today's meeting was about making sure we have, as a government, a laser focus on the role that we can play with allies to see a stable, peaceful transition so that the Syrians get the government they need for the future and the region can see the stability in the future that it also needs.
What about that terrorist group status? Are you considering changing that?
So prescription is not a matter for now. It doesn't stop us talking to all the parties. And our interest in HTS is that they live up to their promises to protect the rights of all individuals and all groups, to respect international law, and to prevent Syria becoming a base for fresh terrorist threats.
John Healey speaking there. Well, we can talk now to our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's here with us. John, what are your reflections after the meeting?
Well, first of all, Mr Healey was the only minister there. This is the second Cobra meeting this week. The first one was just officials. This one was Mr Healey and officials. And you heard him say there in one of his answers, this is not a matter for now. He was asked 6 questions just now. 2 of them he said, it's not a matter for now. And another one he said, it's early days. So when he talked about a laser focus, he did say that he'd spoken to the defence minister in Turkey about what's happening in Syria, but he was very non-committal. Clearly, the British government is taking its time here. He also went on to talk about, just now, he was asked about taking away the citizenship, the British passport of President Assad's wife. Of course, she was born in London. That's not a matter for now. He also talked about Yvette Cooper suspending the asylum process. No further news on that either. Now, what we heard from the Prime Minister yesterday in Prime Minister's questions, he said this could be a turning point, but he said there was no guarantee that things would turn out for the better. That, I sense, is a reaction to going back to 2000 when Assad succeeded his late father as president there. Tony Blair really courted him. He saw the 34-year-old young Prime Minister, President rather, as a moderniser and a reformer he could do business with. And he went to Damascus. Assad came here, saw the Queen. There was even talk of an honorary knighthood for him. But then, of course, it all went sour, it all changed. And, of course, relations completely broke down 2011. The slaughter began, the Arab Spring was absolutely crushed. And you'll probably remember that back in 2013, David Cameron wanted to involve Britain in military intervention in Syria, and he brought MPs back at the end of August that summer, and he lost the vote because it's about 36 or so Tory MPs voted against the government. So a lot of former prime ministers have been bruised, if you like, embarrassed, certainly, by events in Syria. And I think that's why we're seeing a very cautious approach from Sir Keir Starmer And we heard a pretty non-committal Mr Healy there saying very much, that's not a matter for now, wait and see, let's talk to allies. So a lot of jaw to try and prevent war.
Cautious is the word. John, thank you very much indeed. John Craig there, our chief political correspondent. Now, the government wants to talk about planning today. Now, before you start reaching for the off switch, I just want to tell you why you should really care about this story, because in the end, today wasn't about planning, it was about housing. And whatever your views on the solution, virtually everyone agrees that we do have a housing crisis in this country. Homelessness is soaring, and for many young people, getting on the housing ladder is less a dream and more of a fantasy. The post-war period saw a boom in house building as both Labour and Conservative governments rebuilt communities devastated by war and established new developments across the country as well. But it was also the time when the Green Belt was established, first to protect the local environment, but increasingly used, critics argue, by that emerging species, the NIMBY, to pull up the housing ladder away from the next generation. Well, as a result, the number of new builds fell, pushing up prices ever more and pushing the dream of home ownership further away for so many people. We're going to be discussing this more in a moment, but first, here's our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.
Civil engineering. The Prime Minister and his deputy with a blueprint to fix Britain's broken housing market. 1.5 million new homes in this Parliament. That's 370,000 a year. And every council in England must help.
Hello.
A massive promise of future home ownership and deadlines already on the Prime Minister's mind.
How long does it take to finish your apprenticeship for carpentry?
This one's 18 months.
A visit to a housing development in Cambridgeshire. It's areas like this, between two towns, soon to be top of the queue for planning permission.
Well, I've got 1.5 million homes for you to build.
The Prime Minister says he'll stop the blockers, all to help people like Cassie to settle down.
How's it feel to have your own place?
Amazing.
Labour's plan to reclassify bits of the Green Belt into a new developer-friendly grey belt will speed up house building. But when I caught up later with Cassie, who understands the benefits, even she had questions.
When you hear about sort of new building estates being built, one of the biggest things is always, everyone signing petitions of don't build here, things like that. It just needs to be looked into exactly why that is. Why is it that people don't want houses?
It's 50 years since the last house building revolution in the 60s and 70s, back then driven by new tower blocks and council housing. Fast forward to now, private developers fund the work and house building is on a downward trend, and so far from the target set today.
Welcome to Keir Starmer's vision of the future. Show homes like this one, replicated thousands of times on this construction site and all around the country. I was talking to the boss of this construction site who said today was a great start, but there was so much more the government needed to do. Will they now take on some of those environment and nature and habitat rules that developers complain about? And if they do, could they end up in breach of their manifesto?
Of course we want to get the balance right with nature and the environment, but if it comes to a human being wanting to have a house for them and their family, that has to be the top priority.
Conservationists are concerned at the Prime Minister's tone. Could he abandon other promises to get Britain building?
Labour was really clear in its manifesto that it's going to meet the targets in the Environment Act, and the top first target in the Environment Act is to halt the decline of wildlife by 2030. That's really, really difficult. They will not meet the target if they approach growth by ripping up really important protections for wildlife and for our natural environment.
The clearest of targets, but hard to see how they get there without picking big fights. Fixing the foundations, but will Keir Starmer be the one to actually finish the job?
Well, Sam is here with me now. And Sam, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say Keir Starmer needs to get this right. This is his growth mission. And if he's going to deliver all the things he wants to do, then this has to happen.
That's right, Sophie. I want to go back to something in the film to illustrate exactly that point. Let's bring up the graph that you'll have seen, if we can. And what this graph shows is house building in England since the Second World War. And it tells a really fascinating story. Look at this. It builds after the Second World War. And this is the peak. This is the peak. It's in the 60s and 70s. And as I said in the film, it's tower blocks, it's council housing. All of that, Sophie, is publicly funded. But then, as you get through the 70s, the model for housing switches and private development takes over. And bluntly, there's just far less development goes on all the way up to this year. Look, actually, this year is down on the previous year. That's not good. The trend is in the wrong direction. And Keir Starmer has set himself a really ambitious target. Look at this. 370,000. We've never built that number of homes since the Second World War. It's incredible.
Wow.
And we're a very long way away. You can see the gap over on your side of the screen between the amount of houses built today and the number of houses that they need to build per year.
I mean, that's extraordinary, because obviously everyone's talked about how the Prime Minister's got an ambitious target on housing, it's going to be tough to meet it. But I think if you put it in this context, you realise just how far away that red line really is.
Yeah, now there's a small catch with their target, which isn't just new houses. It is also takes into account conversions from office blocks. So that's not a new house, that's just a different form of creating a new dwelling. And it's net of demolitions. So if we look at that, actually it's a little bit closer. If we look in the corner here, for this year, you can see if you put the number of conversions on top, it comes to about, if it ever happens, about there, bluntly. There we go. So it's a little bit closer, but still, the overall story of this is it's incredibly hard. And what Keir Starmer's done today is tackle one bit of it, which is to basically lean on councils, although it's not clear what happens if they don't comply. But there are all sorts of other things. The boss of that big construction company saying the amount that they build depends on things like interest rates coming down, which is completely out of the government's control. And then there are these questions about whether Keir Starmer is willing to have a big fight over nature and habitat and environmental rules. There are so many more barriers before the yellow line there reaches the red line at the top.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there, our Deputy Political Editor, explaining that story to us. Well, of course, the government's big moves on housing, on planning, could well feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the political commentator Tim Montgomery and the Belfast Telegraph columnist Alison Morris. Right. Let's bring on our duo for this evening, shall we? The broadcaster and former government advisor, Mercy Muroki, and the social issues campaigner, Kwajo Tweneboa. Great to have you both on the show. Kwajo, I feel like I've got to start with you on this story, right? Yeah. Because, you know, housing is such an important thing to you. You've obviously been very personally affected by bad housing previously, and you've since gone on to campaign to try and make it better for other people as well. So what's your reaction to what the government's announced today?
Well, there's recognition that this is the biggest housing crisis that we faced since the Second World War and biggest crisis the country faces at the moment. I think there are some positives in regards to their proposal in terms of planning reform. We now know that they want to build 370,000 homes. They want to build 1.5 million homes, and they've set that target. They've also had a brownfield first approach, which I think is a common sense approach, but there is still question marks, and I think the make or break moment comes ahead of the spring spending review, because that is when we find out whether or not the Treasury is going to give the vast sums of money needed in order for the government to deliver all of these big proposals that they've put forward.
It's easy for people to say, look, better housing is needed, and that's clearly true, isn't there? But there is likely to be some resistance to it, Mercy, as well. What's your point of view?
Yeah, so of course there's the sort of big environmental aspect of it, and we use this term NIMBY, not in my backyard, and there's a big lobby of that group, because there are lots of people who think actually we need to protect the countryside, and not just because of environmental reasons, but because people don't want to see sort of tower blocks and, you know, blocks of new build houses kind of being put up all across the countryside. Admittedly, I think if you asked me a few years ago, I was very much a NIMBY. I'm a big countryside person, but I think actually I'm more of a, maybe not a YIMBY, but a MIMBY, maybe in my backyard.
I love that.
Because I think it depends, really. It depends on the quality of the housing that we're saying. It depends on what it does to the character of the countryside and the character of communities. But also, I think there's not enough of a recognition at the moment about the dearth of skills that are needed if Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, is to meet these targets. You know, we don't have the workforce, and we don't even have the vocational pipeline required to kind of meet the kind of demands for sort of carrying out this very ambitious target. So I would like to hear the government talking more about exactly how, in practice, they intend to get these houses put up.
In these stories, I feel we talk a lot about, you know, kind of planning and growth, but really it's about people, isn't it? It's about the houses that people are living in. And I just wondered if you wanted to kind of share some of the things that you've seen, you know, over the years, and the reality of housing in this country.
The reality is, the idea of having a safe and decent, affordable home has become a luxury for far too many. We've seen it with the rates of homelessness and records being broken that we should be absolutely ashamed about. 161,000 homeless kids in England alone, and that is going to have knock-on effects in terms of education, for example. People need homes, and I think after the Second World War, that was that understanding, especially by government, and this government needs to be bold, because far too many people are living in shockingly dangerous conditions, putting their lives at risk. I think there's huge question marks in terms of the homes that government is building. I think there has to be reform in terms of the quality of new builds, because I've been into new builds which, in my own personal opinion, shouldn't have been signed off because they are absolutely horrific. Now,
this is new builds you're talking about. This is not, because people normally think new housing must be quite decent.
And perfect. No, I mean, I've been into new builds 2 years old that are falling to bits. And if we allow them to be built in 5 years' time, the government's going to be facing an even bigger housing crisis. And what we do know is there's far too many people out there that don't have access to a decent and safe and affordable home. But also, within this announcement today, we still are yet to find out how many of those homes are going to be council and social homes, because that is where demand is most acute. We've got 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. And like I said earlier, 161,000 homeless kids who will be waiting for social housing. And if the government is going to meet their targets as promised, we know that hasn't been done since like the 1980s, and that's when they were investing in building council homes. They're going to have to tell us, and sooner rather than later. Having said that, I think that will come after the spring spending review.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because Hassan's graph really illustrated it. This is an ambitious target. And, you know, the Conservative Party knows a thing or two about missed targets, right? You know, Rishi Sunak, you know, gave his kind of pledges and then failed to meet all of them, and then obviously lost the election. I mean, this is a gamble for Keir Starmer, right?
It is a gamble, but I think if he didn't set a target, you know, people would say you're shying away from it. It means we can't hold you to account. It's an ambitious target, actually. Quite frankly, I think, as you mentioned when you were kind of opening the segment, pretty much virtually everybody recognises we have a housing crisis. And actually, it's not only a housing crisis when you think about sort of the current population. I think the Office for National Statistics estimates something like over 6 million people. The population will increase by over 6 million people sort of in the 15 years up to 2030. Where are those people? You know, we already have a housing crisis, as you mentioned. There's already people waiting, over a million people waiting to get on social housing. If we're going to increase the population by 6 million in a matter of, you know, a decade, where are those people going to go? So there's a current acute problem at home, both about the quality and the quantity of housing, but there's also a problem coming down the line in terms of the rate of population increase.
OK, thanks both very much indeed. Now, sometimes a case comes along that is just so unimaginably awful, so heartbreaking that it stops you in your tracks. 10-year-old Sara Sharif was murdered by her father and stepmother, and honestly, the details are just so awful that they just make you want to turn away. But there's something about this case that I just can't wrap my head around. Sara's school reported the family to social services because of bruising to her body. When her father and her stepmother found out, they took her out of school. Apparently to homeschool her, but, you know, let's be honest, it wasn't to homeschool her, was it? You know, she wasn't taken out of school so her dad can teach her algebra. She was taken out of school so she could be abused and that they could get away with it. You know, we're so used to hearing the words, lessons must be learned, and it does feel like that could be a pretty good place to start. Let's listen to the response of the Prime Minister.
My first response is a human response. This is just the most awful case. It's very hard to see and to read about for many people who'll be viewing this. Just shocking. So that's where I start on this. Obviously, there's going to be questions that need to be answered in relation to this case. I don't think that we should allow ourselves to think that whatever the rules on smacking are, that's got anything to do with this case. This is about violence, it's about abuse, it's about making sure there's protection and safeguards for children, particularly those being homeschooled. So that's where I think the questions are. But my response, first and foremost, is a human response. It's just the most awful case that many people, many viewers will find very, very, very hard to hear.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Sara Sackman, the Minister of State at the Ministry of Justice. Her department today released plans to tackle the backlog problem in our court system, but I also wanted to get her views on the Sara Sharif case. Thank you so much for being on the programme. Now, of course, you're here to talk about the review of the court system, which is obviously a very important story that I'm keen to get your take on. But I did just want to start off by talking about the case of Sara Sharif, because it feels to me that very rarely, you know, these cases come along that just knock you off your stride. And the questions are always asked about, you know, what can we learn, what can be done, what do we need to change so this can't happen again? And I just wondered what your reaction is to the abuse and the murder of that little girl.
It's absolutely appalling. It's incredibly heartbreaking and tragic, and to think of the abuse that little girl suffered. I'm glad that she's had a modicum of justice with the conviction for murder of both her father and stepmother, but it's absolutely unthinkable and hard to find the words. And then from the point of view of government, there will be a safeguarding review into the involvement of public agencies that had involvement with Sara, and to see what lessons can be learned from that. But today is really about this little girl who's tragically lost her life at the hands of the very people that should have been looking after her.
Like you say, I'm sure there will be a full review into all aspects of the case. But the one thing that I'm really struggling to get my head around is that she was allowed to be taken out of school. So the teachers reported it to social services, and then, well, we assume, perhaps as a result of that, her dad then takes her out of school to homeschool her. I mean, I use the word homeschool lightly, because let's be honest, that's not what he took.
He was abusing her.
He took her out of her school to get away with abusing her, right?
Yeah.
How can that be possible?
I mean, one of the things that this government is committed to do, and we're announcing plans shortly, is a safeguarding review looking at wholesale reform of children's social care. One of the things we'll be looking into is what further safeguards we can make for children, because protecting children has got to be a #1 priority for any government, and in particular those children that are homeschooled. If, as you say, that's not what was happening here, to make sure there are things like requirements for home inspections, to make sure that there's a register of all children, that we know which children are being homeschooled, and making sure they're properly safeguarded.
Minimum. I mean, surely there should be a register on homeschooling. That feels like just something that should just automatically happen.
I entirely agree, and this government is committed to exactly that. That's an absolute bare minimum, and we may need to go further in terms of providing safeguards precisely that we don't see more cases like this tragedy that Sara experienced.
I guess the thing as well that I'm struggling with, I'm sure many people are struggling with, is we have these horrific cases of child abuse, and we just hear the same things, that lessons will be learned, that it should never happen again, and then it does happen again.
It's appalling. It's an absolute tragedy, and it's evil, right? What we've seen is the fact that the very people that should have been taking care of Sara inflicted, in the end, fatal injuries on her. It is disgusting, but you're right, the role of government is to learn those systemic lessons, and we've got to do that to avoid this tragedy in future. And I don't want to be back here, or any member of the government wants to be back here sat talking to you to see any repeat of this. So we've got to learn those lessons. I'm not going to preempt what the review will recommend, but it's got to be looking across the whole system, every single agency, whether it's police, local authorities, schools, courts, the lot, so that we can avoid such tragedies in future.
OK. You're here because you are launching a review of the criminal courts. Just tell me what the idea is.
So the context for this is that we have our criminal court system that is in crisis. We've inherited a system where there is a backlog of cases that is at record levels, and it's rising. And what this means is that we simply cannot deliver swift justice for victims. We've got some victims that maybe in some of the most serious cases for rape or serious sexual violence that may be waiting as late as 2027 to see their day in court. That's the consequence of the crisis in our criminal courts.
What kind of thing does that mean? I guess that means witnesses, pulling out, it means evidence going cold, and obviously the victims living with the abuse, right?
That's exactly right. So take a victim of rape who may be waiting 1, 2, 3 years for her trial to come to court. You're living with the psychological harm. You cannot get justice, you cannot get closure. And what we're seeing is a number of those victims are actually pulling out of the process, which is actually leading to some of those trials collapsing altogether, which is not only failing to deliver justice delayed is justice denied, but it's also deeply inefficient. And so as a consequence, this government is gripping the crisis like the previous government completely failed to do. We've already taken first steps. We've added 500 court sitting days to increase the capacity. We've extended magistrate sentencing powers. What that means is it will free up capacity in the Crown Court to deal with the most serious cases, transferring less serious cases to the magistrates. But that's not going to be enough. We need bold reform, and that's why we've asked today Sir Brian Leveson to look at the full range of options for how we grip the crisis in our criminal justice system.
I was struck by this bit. You said the review will also look at where technology can be used to drive efficiency and improve how the court functions. Are you looking at AI being used in the court system?
Technology and looking at efficiency will be a very important part of it, but I think what we're asking Sir Brian to look at in this first phase is fundamental reform of things like the classification of offences, whether we need to be looking at extending magistrate sentencing powers.
But you are considering AI, right? I mean, people say this is a kind of revolutionary thing that could speed everything up. Is that what you're looking at here?
To deliver the absolute prerequisite requirement of a fair trial, we will always have human involvement, whether that's judges, whether that's juries. That's always going to be important. But where we can deploy technology to increase efficiency in terms of case management systems and all of that, it's right that we look at that as part of the mix as well.
And AI is included, when you say technology, that means AI as well. I'm just trying to be clear.
Absolutely. AI has got to be part of the mix in terms of that efficiency review, and Sir Brian has included that within the scope of his review.
You are very frank in saying that this is a court system in crisis. At the same time, many people will look at funding of the courts, and the Ministry of Justice hasn't been historically a protected department like schools, like the NHS, and it isn't now, right? Rachel Reeves has also asked you to look at your departments to find 5% of efficiency savings. I mean, is that possible in a department that you admit is in crisis?
We've inherited a crisis from the previous government.
You've made that point already. You've made that point already. What I'm asking about right now, is it possible to cut 5% from your department?
Well, we need to live with the fiscal reality and the fiscal inheritance that we've had from the previous government, the 22 billion black hole, which is important to talk about.
You've got it out there. You've got it out there.
But it's important when we're talking about today that even if we were to run the Crown Court system at absolute capacity, at its maximum capacity, that would still fail to keep up with the level of demand that's coming into the system. And that's a really important fact, because what we need to look at is pretty fundamental reform. And that's why what we've said to Sir Brian Leveson is we've got to deal with the fiscal reality, but the sorts of reforms we're looking at, things like reclassification of offences, whether we should be extending magistrates' powers and taking out some of those cases from the Crown Court into the lower courts, whether we need to look at something like an intermediate court for certain offences. That's not about necessarily spending extra money, but it is about the sort of reform that is going to deliver swifter justice for victims.
OK, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll get a reaction to that from Mercy and Kwajo. Stay with us.
First Minister, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Nice to see you.
How are you feeling? Looking forward to getting into the parliamentary chamber.
Are you any further forward to making a decision?
No, it's an important day today.
All of the claims were in line with my parliamentary duties, so I'm making that clear to you, Conor.
He was a Scot through and through.
He was a very good politician.
Alex Salmond was controversial, he was a disruptor, but above all, he was respected.
Will you resign if you lose this week?
Again, I'm not planning to, of course, lose the vote of no confidence. I'm planning to win that vote of no confidence.
His face said it all.
My intention to stand down as party leader.
This is now a storm with deadly consequences. How are they feeling?
They're a bit scared at the minute.
We've been told to evacuate.
How are you feeling?
Devastated.
Hundreds of homes were wiped out by flooding. I'm Connor Gillis, Sky's Scotland correspondent.
It was probably the darkest time in my life.
Scott is 5 years sober after a cocaine addiction left him close to death.
Scotland has a shameful record, worse than England, the worst in Europe.
Why not just say you failed? Because then you might get more respect from families who've lost loved ones.
This is where one of the UK's most prolific rapists thought he'd got away with murder.
Sky News can reveal that former sex workers had told police he was sexually violent.
My Emma.
Free wherever you get your news. It's over, isn't it?
The Americans say he is Rossi, a fraudster.
This has been one of the most bizarre cases ever heard in a courtroom in this country.
A dangerous murderer.
Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Andrew Ennis after this?
She said she can forgive him, but as long as he's behind bars.
By doing the right thing, it's destroyed your life.
They terrorised me. They intimidated me.
Sky News, the full story first.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers. We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Hello, welcome back. Now, before the break, we were hearing from the government about what action needs to be taken after the Sara Sharif case. We can bring in Mercy and Kwajo to talk through this. It's an awful case, isn't it? It's just so horrific and upsetting. Mercy, what are your kind of takeaways from it?
I mean, this case feels personal to me for a couple of reasons. One, my daughter's 10 in 2 months, so you know, I know what a 10-year-old girl is like, and I know how innocent and gorgeous, you know, children at that age are, and the idea that somebody would do something so horrific and so barbaric, I do not even have words to describe how my feelings towards that, not words I can say on national TV at this time anyway. And I think what we can do now is make sure that justice is served, and the harshest possible sentence that that our justice system has to offer is served out. What I would say as well is, to your point about how the family were allowed to take Zara out of school despite the fact they'd been reported to social services. I have some sort of anecdote on that front too, because during the pandemic, I took my daughter out of education. It just wasn't going well for her, and you know, I took her out of education for a while.
As many people did during the pandemic, right?
And you know, that's a legal right for parents. You have to send a letter to the head teacher of the school, and you have a legal right to take your child out of education. But what I can say is that since then, I had never had a single piece of communication from my local authority. So they have no idea where my child is, you know, what, you know, they don't know. And so that system to me feels fundamentally wrong. And we know that there are so many children who during the pandemic were taken out of school and have never returned. The Centre for Social Justice have released statistics about this, you know, in the six figures, children who left school during the pandemic, and now we don't know where those children are. That is a fundamentally broken system, and I think the government really does need to do something about that to avoid cases like this.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about your own experience of homeschooling and the, you know, the lack of any response or communication from authorities. It's quite shocking, actually.
I mean, it's absolutely tragic. I mean, first and foremost, in regards to the social service sector, we know over the last few years they've endured major cuts and they are stretched at the moment, but that is no justification or excuse for what's happened in this situation. I mean, for example, her being pulled out of school on a report made to social services, that should have acted as a red flag. Unfortunately, it didn't. But also communication and sort of cross-communication between multiple agencies is really poor at the moment. Through my line of work, I deal with vulnerable people, and I see time and time again where communication is so poor, these individuals are being failed, and that's exactly what's had happened in this situation. But on top of that, when it comes to homeschooling and safeguarding, the fact that there isn't the proper safeguarding in place means that kids and children, especially in this case, end up slipping through the net. But also, I think questions need to be raised in regards to border control and why her father was allowed to flee the country after murdering her and got out so easily. I mean, they need to create reviews to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. It's a monumental failure on behalf of multiple agencies. And if perhaps they had noticed something earlier and acted upon it, she would still be here today.
That's it, isn't it? Like you say, it's so many different agencies failing at so many different points. And obviously the people who are to blame for this are the people who murdered her. But we, as a society, have to look at what we can do to try and
protect
stop
young
and
kids,
protect young kids. Exactly. Thanks both very much indeed. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. As the media regulator prepares to issue new guidance on online harm, I speak to the father of Molly Russell, who took her own life after viewing thousands of images promoting suicide and self-harm. Hello, welcome back. Now, next week we are expecting the media regulator Ofcom to publish new guidance on what they'll be doing, asking companies to do with harmful content online. Watching closely will be the families of those who have suffered by being exposed to this kind of material. Well, I'm pleased to say that I'm joined now by Ian Russell, who began a campaign for social media companies to better protect young people after his 14-year-old daughter Molly took her own life. He later discovered that she'd been viewing thousands of images promoting suicide and self-harm. Thank you very much for being with us. It's the first time I've interviewed you, so we're very pleased to have you on the programme. There's lots of stuff that you obviously have been campaigning for an awful long time in memory of your daughter. It's 7 years since Molly died. Do you think the internet is now a safer place for someone like her?
In principle, no. There have been changes, and those changes have sometimes brought a little bit of increased safety, but nothing like the level of safety that parents around the country, around the world, are asking for. And it's quite crazy that I feel we should have learnt our lessons so much quicker. And I think that's fuelled this amazing and completely understandable groundswell of public opinion that says, what are we doing about this? Why aren't we seeing change? But I also think, as no doubt we'll talk about, that we're on the verge of beginning to see change happening, and that's because of regulation that is impending. It's not all perfect, but I think that's the best way to bring about the safer internet that people want.
But before we talk about that regulation, why do you think it has taken so long to see change?
I think we were all caught on the back foot. I think we were seduced by the glittery prizes that big tech offers, and sometimes we still are. In some ways, we're making similar mistakes that we have made with conventional digital technology, with new tech, where we're letting AI have an upper hand and not insisting that basically digital technology, like any other product we use in the modern world, should be tested for safety before it's released on the public. The digital world seems to allow that technology just to be released and the public to be the crash test dummies in a digital way.
So you're worried about AI then?
I think so. I mean, AI can also be a way to look for harm and do good, but it increases the speed of change, it increases the quickness with which we have to react. It's taken 5 years to get the Online Safety Act through Parliament. It's taking Ofcom another year and a half or more to consult, which is what they have to do in order to put the Act into practice. These things take time. We can't afford that sort of time.
Well, Ofcom will release its illegal harms code of practice next week, so effectively online services, social media sites, etc., what they should be doing to keep people safe online. How optimistic are you about what we're going to see?
So the honest truth is, I'm not particularly optimistic about next week's announcement. It's quite a complicated process. I struggle to keep up with it. This is just the measures they'll put in place for illegal harms, but we don't believe, and none of us have seen it, we're waiting for Monday, I think it is, when they release it. We don't believe there will be a measure about suicidal self-harm included in the illegal harms consultation that they're making an announcement about, which to me is quite incredible, given that protecting children from these dangers was one of the main tenets of the whole Online Safety Act. I think things will improve. There are many of us who are encouraging Ofcom to be bolder, to move towards the edges of what the Act allows them to do, to take their responsibilities to the limits of what they can do as a regulator in order to make the world safer. We're also calling for the government to move and to move faster, because as you watch Ofcom trying to enforce the Act, it becomes clearer where the Act as drafted at the moment isn't strong enough, doesn't work well enough. And so we're asking the government to think very quickly and not waste time in introducing a sort of Online Safety Act 2 to keep up with the pace of change of tech and to improve where the Act is failing at the moment. We've,
Of course, seen a change of government relatively recently with Keir Starmer. What do you make of the new Labour government, and have you had much to deal with them?
So we've had a few chats with the Secretary of State. You know, it's an ongoing process. I think it's only 6 months in. Instinctively, as a bereaved parent, I think Peter Carl, as Secretary of State, is committed to making a difference. He issued a thing called a Statement of Strategic Priorities only a few weeks ago. He didn't ever have to do that, but that's a way he's got, not many ways, because the regulator should be independent of government. That's one way he can influence the regulator to be stronger. So he's taken that step, which is a promising sign. And I will continue, when there are opportunities to have conversations with him, about taking measures to move faster, to bring in new legislation, to make sure the Act is structurally strong enough for a regulator to work within.
He said that he's looking at a ban on social media for under-16s. But you're not a fan. I was quite surprised by that, I'll be honest. I expected it to be something that you would be supportive of.
It seems a little bit counterintuitive. Lots of people are talking about bans. But there are measures in the Act that have all the beneficial effects a ban might bring with it, without the unintended consequences and the punishment of children by depriving them of good digital technology. Mustn't forget we live in a digital world, and it's important that children grow up in a safe digital world. Also a ban, if you just look at Australia, who've are beginning the process of trying to introduce a ban, that's going to take 12 months before anything happens. And then there's probably going to be further consultation and a transition period. This is what we've learned about the introduction of the Online Safety Act. A ban would slow the process down and would expose young people to harms that would hopefully be covered sooner by the Online Safety Act that is already just about to take effect.
I was quite interested, just thinking about the beginning of the interview, when you were saying that people were almost caught a bit on the back foot by technology, by social media, kind of the glitz of it. And I was thinking about the kind of technology companies a bit when you were saying that. Because at the minute, it feels like we have these kind of tech bros who are like striding the world stage. You've got Zuckerberg nominated for Time Person of the Year. You've got Elon Musk, who's like, the right-hand man of Donald Trump. It feels a bit like they're untouchable. Is that a kind of worry for you?
I think that is a genuine concern. That's a wider concern. I think we should, all of us in the democratic countries of the world, we should be particularly concerned for our democracies. We should, whether we like them or not, our governments are things that we can vote out if we don't like what they're doing. So any group of people who could bring unelected power to exert on those democracies is something that we quite naturally should be concerned about. And the closeness in America is something, it remains to be seen what will happen, but we need to monitor that closely. But it's important that our government don't get too close to these companies. It's important our government maintain that distance between the companies. Obviously, they're keen to attract investment. But in terms of safety, there's no reason why you can't insist that digital products are designed with safety in mind. So when they're brought to market, there's very little danger for people and children who use them.
There's been a suggestion that Elon Musk could donate money to reform, right? Is there a concern about political donations from these big... I guess people often donate for influence, don't they?
I genuinely think things are moving so fast, it's really hard to tell. Of all the people on the planet, Elon Musk, I think he tweeted, I might not get this quite right, but I think he tweeted children's safety is our number one priority, or is the number one priority. So, on one hand, he's saying what so many of us believe in. And what remains to be seen and what's important is how he uses the responsibility that he will no doubt have in America. And how wisely he uses that, and how much that fits in with the democratic process.
Lots of big questions, as you say. It's been a real pleasure to interview you. I have to say, the way that you've taken this tragedy that must have just completely blown up the whole of your life as well as your family's life, and you've used it and campaigned and tried to make a difference is very inspiring to a lot of people. So thank you very much for being on the programme.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you.
I should say, if you have been affected by anything we discussed in that interview, you can contact the Samaritans on 116 123 or email joe@samaritans.org. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Well, before we go tonight, we are going to update you on a somewhat unlikely political row sparked by Kemi Badenoch after she claimed that sandwiches are, in her words, not a real food. Yes, really. We will fill you in after the break.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock, the Prime Minister demands answers over the murder of Sara Sharif. The 10-year-old's father and stepmother were convicted yesterday. And a catalogue of failings has now emerged, which allowed Sara to be in her father's care despite the authorities' concerns about him. Also coming up, the NHS warns of a tidal wave of flu hitting England's hospitals. And the government puts itself on a collision course with local planners and environmentalists with its controversial plan to solve the housing shortage. All that and more on the UK Tonight, coming at 8.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran?
No, no, no.
Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing.
As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News.
I want to be treated equally like everyone else.
It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
Very diminished by claims that you're a racist.
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Today in Manchester, there is nothing quite like it. Blue and red rock horns. Sports most compelling soap opera.
The Manchester Derby on USA.
Hello, welcome back. Now, an unlikely political row has broken out after the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, rather boldly claimed in an interview with The Spectator that sandwiches are not real food and lunch is for wimps. Well, it prompted a defence from the Prime Minister of what his official spokesperson's called a great British institution. Keir Starmer, we're told, is quite happy with a sandwich lunch. Well, that led to Kemi Badenoch responding with this on X not long after. She said, the PM has time to respond to my jokes about lunch, but no time for the farmers who produce our food. And of course, he's never one to miss an opportunity on social media. Reform UK's leader, Nigel Farage, also gave his take on Sandwichgate.
The leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition, Kemi Badenoch, says that lunch is for wimps. Well, I tell you what, I think that lunch is pretty cool. But on the busy days, I stay in the office and have a sandwich. She even thinks sandwiches are wrong. Now, I leave it up to you, centre-right voters, to decide what kind of leadership you want. Lunch is for wimps or me? Cheers, everybody.
It's freaking mercy and Kwajo, shall we? I just have no idea what is going on at the minute. It's like sandwiches, the new culture wars. We've got Kemi Badenoch with a steak at a desk for lunch. We've got Keir Starmer, who's a fan of the traditional sandwich. Nigel Farage, glass of red wine with a PFL, which is a proper lunch that I can't say the middle word on TV. So it is extraordinary. Mercy, what's your take on sandwiches?
Well, I've had at least one sandwich today. Well, it was a baguette, actually. I was actually just saying, is a wrap a sandwich? Is a baguette a sandwich? Yeah. We're suddenly kind of debating the ins and outs of sandwiches. I think it's nice to have levity sometimes in politics, but it's all a bit silly, isn't it? That's the overwhelming feeling I have.
Yeah.
Lunches for wimps?
Well, I didn't think I was going to wake up to this debate, to be honest, over sandwiches.
You thought you were going to have a serious conversation on Sky News.
Yeah, I know. Well, to be fair, I think lunch is important for everyone, especially during work. I mean, a few years ago, we were talking about how important work-life balance is, and I think people deserve breaks. I think sandwiches are all right, to be fair, if you have a good one. I mean, I'm very critical of breakfast because I don't like breakfast. I don't have breakfast, but I love lunch. and
Critical
dinner.
of breakfast. That's strong.
Oh, I know it is.
You know,
but
I'm not a breakfast person either, I have to say. I'm really not. But I do quite like lunch and dinner, so it makes up for it.
Yeah.
If you're wondering about the sandwiches on the table, I should say that they were mysteriously brought in by John Craig. I'm not really sure where they've come from, what the relevance is, but John Craig's come in the ad break to bring us in some sandwiches. We've got tuna and cucumber over there, and this one looks like a kind of cheese melt, a cheese wrap. So there you go.
Looking a bit worse for wear, that cheese wrap.
Yeah.
I do love a tuna sandwich.
Is that your?
Tuna's the best one, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
What? So. What I'm interested in, Mercy, in your take, because you know Kemi Badenoch, obviously you kind of work with her, and I'm just. What do you think about her kind of wading into this row? Is this part of her showing, as you say, a bit of levity, a bit of personality, or is it, I guess, a culture war too far?
Yeah, I mean, I can actually confirm that she does have lunch. She doesn't take lunch breaks, per se. I think that's the point she was actually making, that lunch breaks are for wimps. I don't particularly agree. I love a lunch break. But I think she was saying lunch break is for wimps rather than lunch itself. And she does have lunch brought to her desk because she was a very busy woman. But look, I think I said this a few weeks ago, actually, that she hasn't been saying things necessarily policy-wise, because she's been very open that they're undergoing a big policy review at the moment. So she doesn't want to be coming out with all these big policy announcements. She wants to do this big listening exercise and, make a concerted effort to come up with policy. So, she has to stay in the news somehow. Maybe this is just a way of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone can have steak brought to their desk during their lunch hour, so I think my advice would be take your breaks and enjoy your tuna sandwiches.
I love it. It's very good. Very good.
Profound. Very profound.
Yeah, what do you think? What do you make of Kemi Badenoch's cut through so far, then?
Oh, I think there's been a lot of debate around controversial subjects such as this. I mean, she is new to it, and we saw during Prime Minister's questions, there was a lot of conversation online after that. But I think she's still getting to her feet, I think. And I thought it was quite a laugh until it was turned into political point scoring, I think. But it's good to have humour, I think, in politics, so we have to see what else she comes out with.
Yeah, I thought it was quite funny at the beginning as well, actually. But now I think that it's gone
too far.
We're kind of bringing in like the farmers and all this. It is looking a bit point score as well. How do you think Nigel Farage responded?
Well, I think Nigel Farage, I don't particularly agree with many things Nigel Farage says. I'm definitely not a reform voter or supporter. However, I think he's the smartest politician when it comes to social media use. I think he has massive reach. He knows how to use social media. He's an incredibly appealing politician, incredibly social media savvy, and lots of young men. I think amongst young men, Nigel Farage is the most popular politician. So what I would say about him is he knows how to kind of use social media to his own benefit and get into any debate.
Thanks both very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. That's all from us tonight. I'll see you on Monday at 7. Up next, it's the UK Tonight with Matt Barbette, who I'm sure has got much more serious things to talk to you about this evening. See you Monday.